the research clearly is based around how people found World Youth Day, what their aspirations were. So therefore, each of you are as important to the research project that I conducted as the work that I did. And everyone has their own take on World Youth Day. And I suppose one of the things that I would like to share with you to start with is, and this is back the front, because last time I gave you the post-World Youth Day survey. Today I'd actually like to give you the pre-World Youth Day survey. And I suppose because you, like the people that you'll travel with, will have your own thoughts about World Youth Day, this particular World Youth Day. Like, is every World Youth Day the same? No, it's not. It's very radically different. And people go for different reasons. Like a European World Youth Day, like Madrid, for example, or Krakow, will be nuanced by the possibility of travelling through the Holy Land or becoming familiar with the church in Europe. But a World Youth Day like in Central America, which has never been held before, we got the glimpse of Rio in 2013, Buenos Aires in 1987. They were South American World Youth Days. But therefore, it's going to be very different because the experience and reality of church is different. The Church of Latin America is very different to the Church of Europe and of Australia. But at the same time, it's one holy, Catholic and apostolic church. So it's about recognising the things that unify us as Christians, as Catholics. And I think that sometimes people talk about World Youth Day as an opportunity for people to be immersed in the church, but I would always bring it back to, do we really only refer to the notion of ecclesia when in the New Testament it was mentioned 3 times? Or do we talk about kingdom of God and the relationship with God and people searching for God? And although people are in this room, and one would assume steeped in their work in the church, that doesn't necessarily mean that their number one reason for going is to deepen their relationship with God. But how are you different? Just as in the person who's been married for 40 years and the one who's just been married, they might want to strengthen their marriage. That might be a core aim of anything that they do. So it's about this notion of how do your aspirations as group leaders, which are important, align to the aspirations of your group? And do we believe that World Youth Day pilgrims see the event through some myopic worldview? No, they don't. They'll be radically different because of their own experiences of church and of life generally and when they're at. And I think that because there's been a shift, for better or for worse, and you would judge that, to a younger World Youth Day audience from Australia, predominated, at least to 20 to 25% by school-aged pilgrims, therefore the dynamic changes. So can you ask young people who are school students, influenced radically by their peers, probably more than anybody, and family, of course, to have the same aspirations as the person who is a die-hard Catholic who goes to Mass more than once a week and is regularly receiving the sacraments? No, you can't. So how do you package a pilgrimage which balances the two? In every pilgrim there's a tourist, and in every tourist there's a pilgrim. Because if you only have an experience which is being steeped totally in the tradition of the church, I believe you've lost them. Like I've often said to people, our encounter with God, while we have an understanding of God through our tradition, through sacred scripture, our understanding of God, for me, in the reality of life, is brought face to face when we encounter the beauty of nature. And we see the magnificence of God in that. Because what we describe as beautiful things that are human-made is dwarfed in comparison by those things which are natural and the beauty of nature itself and of God at work. And I suppose it's about, how do we capture that in a way which is relevant? Because each of us at this time and space right now, in our work and in our leadership roles, in taking responsibilities for others, because anybody who is the leader of anything and who puts their hand up and says, yeah, I'll take a group to this, even if it's you with a group of friends nominate what film you're going to go and see, you want it to be good. You don't want it to be a disaster. So if you recommend a holiday place in some part of Australia that you're familiar with, your hope is that everyone else will love it as much as you. And so because it's your judgment that's on the line and it's your call. So it's about how do we make the right call, and how do we know that, there are always going to be risks. There are. There's a risk of tripping over the carpet. There's a risk of tripping over that cord underneath the table, etc. All of those things. But do we get paranoid and paralysed by risk, or do we say, we need to do things differently? Like, I am regretful, for example, that students of Sydney Catholic schools did not go to to Auschwitz and Birkenau in the last trip to Krakow, because I think at this day and age, people could be given a choice to that. And I suppose it's about our readiness of choices. And in the conversations coming into the room, and people are talking about Mexico and Panama and Peru and America and Costa Rica and all of these other places, most of which in Central America we have never been to. We might have a vague knowledge of it in some way, shape or form, but we really are disconnected from Central America largely. So I wanted to, before moving on to your thoughts about experiences, would ask you to think of your personal number one hope for World Youth Day Panama. Your hope. Not your group's, your personal hope. Would anyone like to share any of those? Lee, your hope for this World Youth Day in Panama?
Anthony, I think my hope would be that the church becomes quite open to going. That would be my main hope.
Yeah, look, I've heard a lot of talk around Zika virus, for example. And it was a pandemic in 2016, but even in the US, they are now downgrading it, the whole notion of the risks that it presents, because its prevalence in, for example, Texas and Florida, and there are parts of look, if you look at the nations that are prone to Zika virus, Singapore's one of them, United States of America is one of them. So does that mean we don't travel to the US because we're afraid of Zika virus? And look, we will always be paralysed by fear. Look, anyone who goes to the Holy Land, people know what they're taking, but that doesn't mean you throw caution to the wind. And we know that there were problems in Turkey, for example, last time, and there was political unrest, which would have made going a mistake. Nothing happened during the time that we were away, but had it happened, then it would have been catastrophic. But it's about taking precautions, and it's about knowing that I think World Youth Day is a gift for these countries, just as World Youth Day was a gift for Australia, and World Youth Day was a gift for the US in '93. Or it's not just about what the universal church gets out of it, it's what the local church gets out of it. And I think Pope Francis has made very clear he wants to see parts of the church that have often been on the margins actually take centre stage, even for a brief period of time, and be renewed in that. And so on, I think it's about just using your common sense. Anybody who's been a teacher, like every priest who gives a sermon knows the risk is it's going to fall flat. Does that mean they never give a homily? Are we paralysed into silence or inaction because we are afraid? Or do we actually get on and do something? Do missionaries say these lands are inhospitable and therefore we can never evangelise to them? Or do we actually see the great challenge of evangelisation and make it work? And so I think anybody who's been to the Northern Territory and Ross River fever and all those things, far as equally as dangerous. Yeah, Zika has a particular profile, but it's about reading what the profile is and taking the precaution, rather than saying, oh no, well it's just all too great of a problem, we will hide at home. So yeah, they're my thoughts on the matter, and I agree with you entirely. Other hopes just around the room. Yes, Father.
My hope is full of hope, and what I mean by that, I want to repeat after wonderful mystic Julian Norwich, all will be well, or all shall be well.
Yeah, thank you. And again, it's probably one of the virtue that's forgotten. When we talk about faith, hope and love, hope is the one that's often forgotten. And Mary, who's considered the star of hope, but it's often the one that's relegated to the side and we don't speak about it. Other hopes, other aspirations? Yeah, Malcolm.
Anthony, I hope that we as the church in Australia learns a new way or different ways of being church or expressing our faith, diversifying rather than just based on a European model. We're now a very multicultural society. What does the church in Central America, how does that help us understanding of being who we are?
Yeah, it's interesting. John Paul II's new evangelisation was articulated in Haiti in Central America about in 1983. And within a month, he actually called for the Festival of Hope, he called it, for in 1984. So ironically, it was a visit to Central America where he started the whole notion that the church needs to put new energy and new vision, new ardour into its means of evangelisation. And the fact that we are not a myopic church. One look at this room says that it's about being, we are already big, but it's being big enough to accept that diversity. Komenchak, a famous theologian, said, one single vision will never exhaust the riches of the mystery of God. And it's very true about the fact that, Catholicism, there is a rich tapestry there. And our expressions of that, and people's expressions of it, are shaped by culture. Like, when Jesus Christ said, go out and baptise all nations in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, the Indigenous peoples of Australia had existed here for 90,000 years perhaps, prior to that injunction, that great commissioning injunction of baptising all nations. And so it's about that notion that we shouldn't have a tunnel view, but that we should be open enough and broad enough to understand that people operate by virtue of their cultural experience. And the cultural experiences of Latin America, for example, are radically different to Australia or North America or Asia or Africa or Europe. And the whole geopolitical, if you use that term, power of the church will change over time anyway, as the population base changes. And so our population base will move to Africa and to Asia, or to the Great South, as it's called. That's a reality. We tend to, as Westerners, look at time in very short periods of time. A year, 2 years, a decade. Asians look at it in terms of millennia. And it's about that long-term view of where we're going. And I suppose it's hard if our millennia, and so if you think about that as Christians, we might be 2-year-old infants, but the Indigenous might be the 100-year-old in the nursing home, if you compare that on the age of a person. So so we've got the whole notion of hoping to to get involved and be on board, hope for hope's sake, and the whole notion of being big enough and being of diverse enough. And that's the thing, like, do we force all of these different groups in Australia? And I think, we fail to a degree to engage effectively with Chinese Australians, with Indian Australians, with people from South Korea. I think there are parts of Asia that we don't think about, but where there's a very dominant Catholic population base in them, and I believe that they are underrepresented. For example, when we talk about the Eastern eparchies, and we can rattle off Maronites and Melkites and Chaldeans, the Arabic ones, and we think of the Ukrainians, we forget about the Syro-Malabar, who trace their roots back to St Thomas himself. And so that there. So World Youth Day, any one last comment about hopes? Well, my thought then is I actually would suggest to you, I think in planning World Youth Day, you need to know your group and you need to know what they're hoping for. There's nothing worse, and Michael will tell you this, than having a leader who's got his own views or her own views about where things should go, and then that's the worldview. And the fact that there needs to be a sharing of views. And I'd encourage that. And I give you this handout, and if you want the electronic version of it, you can use it. You can use an online version of it. I gave this form out to people just as a way of getting a sense of, well, what are they looking for? Because one of the things that I would also just perhaps suggest to you is that people don't have singular hopes. Yes, I want to deepen my relationship with God. And I also want to get to know the church a bit better. But I want to be able to make new friends and to be able to engage with other people more comfortably. I want to know that although, and see, a lot of you are lucky, you work in religious-based institutions, workplaces maybe that are open to your faith. A lot of the people that you'll be taking will come from professions where faith is rubbished. Not just seen in an objective or passive way, but if you're a university student and you're coming to World Youth Day, do you really believe that you are typical of your colleague students at a campus of 20 or 30 or 40,000 university students? Do you think all those other university students see the world and see religion as you see it? And do you think you're going to have a critical mass of like-minded believers to go back to and share the experience with? What about the people on your pilgrimage whose parents even rubbish what you're doing? Who say, what are you going to go and do that for? What about the people on your pilgrimage who have friends or relatives in their lives who have been abused and are victims of institutional abuse, and they have the hang-ups about religious institutions? What about the people who are coming here who have no faith themselves? Like World Youth Day, when it started, and John Paul, and Malcolm articulates this very well and effectively. Malcolm probably was at the World Youth Day, and there might have been others in the room, but you are it, from what I can gather, as the veteran for 1997 in Paris. That was a bit of a tipping point. And then John Paul II very cleverly said, we will have a World Youth Day in the Jubilee year, and we will make it in Rome. Yes, he couldn't put it in Jerusalem because of practical problems, so he put it in Rome. And so suddenly thousands of young Australians went comparatively to previous World Youth Days because it was the whole notion of pilgrimage in a Jubilee year as it was a World Youth Day in a Jubilee year. World Youth Days never, ever, I don't believe, looked back. Toronto, I think, is a little bit similar to Panama. Toronto, when they went there, and a very modern suburban city like Sydney, they went through the USA and they also went through Central America, a lot of them, and engaged with indigenous spiritualities in Canada. So it's about, well, how do I don't need to go to the Holy Land for this to be a religious pilgrimage. And I don't need to go to the Vatican for this to be a religious pilgrimage. Remember, it wasn't just Sydney that ended up in a racecourse. Paris's was in a racecourse. Some of them are in airfields. Some of them are on, the nice one was Copacabana Beach. But so you've got all of these different settings. They are not religious settings. But suddenly, that world changes in that place because of what takes place. When you go through all of these questions, if you do, with young people about expectation, not a lot of the ones now, but I would say to you a lot of them early on, particularly in 2011, 2013, said the thing they were looking forward to the most was Stations of the Cross. Why? Because the Sydney one was spectacular, as the Toronto one was. It was publicly staged. And then Madrid's, as I would say from a personal perspective, was a letdown. Brazil's was interesting. Krakow's, and again, they've never been the same, that publicly staged event. So it's about what you find. And then, of course, we had Madrid, and we had, when you talk about final masses, people's memories of Madrid are the lockout, or the hurricane, or the hurricane that hit the vigil the night before and blew the tent down where they supposedly kept all the hosts to give to the 2 million people the next day. And then the dilemmas go on. People have memories of World Youth Day, good and bad. People will remember the crowd crush for the one food station at Krakow when you could have just said no to the little bit of food you were going to get and get in simply without a problem. So it's about just how you plan around that. But I actually would like to take, and it is Father George, isn't it? Father George's word. I think you just got to give the young people who are going hope for this event. That it's something to look forward to. Look, and I'm not being cynical here, but when I go to Mass each week, most of the people in the pews are older than me. So if I'm 17, yes, that is possible. But what is that? What about a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old? And I just saw him and I didn't recognise him. At the back there, Chris Cotter from Wagga. And Chris did a terrific thing with his young teachers. And they said it. He might have said it, but I wouldn't have believed him. But he did a very good thing with his young teachers in Rio. And they used to meet regularly for debriefings. And just to reflect on the day. Because one of the, just as, you know, and I went to a funeral yesterday and life has gone in the blink of an eye, a pilgrimage has gone in a smaller blink. And a pilgrimage will be over before you feel it's even started. And that whole idea of how do I pace myself on this pilgrimage? How do I stop to talk about what I'm seeing and how I'm feeling about it? How I'm engaging with it. Because Gabrielle and Russell and Malcolm and all of the group leaders here will, I'm sure, design wonderful pilgrimages. But will it just be a blur of memories where everyone's worrying about getting a picture on Facebook or Instagram? Or will there actually be time for reflection on a daily basis? And I think that's the key. Because to reflect on the pilgrimage is necessary in order to prepare people for what will be a frenetic period of activity and disorganisation over 5 to 7 days. And it will be. You basically fly by the seat of your pants and hang on during World Youth Day week, and you're glad to get to the airport or get home or get stranded in Dubai or somewhere like that, I'm not sure. But whatever. But it's about how do I pace myself during the week? How do I, and as Malcolm said, you know, this is a church that I'm not accustomed to. I'm accustomed to the little old lady playing the organ and the little old man being the altar server and me sitting in the pew. That's what I'm used to. I'm not used to in Rio all these girls dancing with Pope Francis as they did with John Paul II in '86 here at the Sydney Cricket Ground. I'm not used to that. I'm not used to suddenly total silence with 2 million people in adoration when people generally aren't quite, even at a funeral or a wedding or a mass. And so there are these things which are countercultural all the way through. World Youth Day is the opposite to a normal Catholic experience of life, especially in Australia. I think you probably would get more of it in its normal state in Latin America. You'll get more of that vibrancy and more of that energy, and possibly parts of Europe or the great pilgrimage centres of Europe or Holy Land. 2 questions from the floor. Any 2 questions or comments? I trust you're hearing me even with the headphones, so you're free to ask a question. 1 minute, 2 questions. Any questions, any comments, any reflections? Abel, you're new to the room. I met Abel in 2006 and he reminded me of it, and I thought, boy, I must have been an old-looking young man. Do you have a comment, Abel? Okay. Mark?
Just endorse your comment about the importance of that reflection time as part of the pilgrim journey. It was a key emphasis for our pilgrimage on Parramatta.
Yeah, and Parramatta's done it really well, I think, and what you've achieved there, and I think you've done great things at downtime for people to come together. And I think the work of the National World Youth Day Committee, Malcolm and Gabrielle, the quality of that journal now, boy. And not everything has to be captured on an iPhone. And I always say to people, don't race around trying to get the best photo. Don't worry about it. So the best photo will be in your mind anyway. Your mind will remember that. And there are places you should not be taking photographs. I caused a security problem in Sistine Chapel where I wanted to get a photograph and they saw the flash, but I was short, fortunately, and couldn't be sighted. But there are other places like, you would never take a photo at Auschwitz, and you would never take photos in some places, I don't believe, which are monuments in Central America. Be culturally sensitive. The memories will be in your mind. The memories will be in your conversations. Get off your iPhone. Talk to the person next to you. Shut it down, and hopefully the coverage will go down. That's what I would be praying for the 2 weeks. Okay, so look, I'm going to leave it there. You're free to use the survey. I can send it to you, and you might want to do it as a bit of a group think before your group goes away. So enjoy your planning. Thank you.